Jim Stenman knows a good story, and it also happens that he can tell one, which shouldn't be surprising considering he's a media entrepreneur and a broadcaster whose career has included stints at Warner Media and CNN International, which he worked at for almost a decade. He's created all kinds of digital content and covered stories across the world and interviewed some pretty engaging people, including The Daily Show's host, Trevor Noah. And as interesting as that may sound, his own story is just as fascinating. It starts in a town outside of Stockholm, where he grew up with a Swedish father and an Ethiopian mother who moved to Sweden as a refugee. As you will hear, the influence of those merged backgrounds shaped how he's seen identity, culture, and class. And just as important, has had an impact on the kinds of stories that he seeks and wants to tell. In this episode, from his current location in Dubai, he shares his experiences growing up in a mixed-race household in Sweden, delves into his memories living both in the United States and in the United Kingdom during his university and early professional years, and discusses the benefits of not fitting into prescribed social boxes. He also deconstructs the challenges of trying to tell stories that are often overlooked and the struggle in changing a resistant system. As Jim will tell you, he's known from a young age that he wanted to work in media. But in this episode, I get to put him in the spotlight. Welcome to the Global Chatter. So let's start from the beginning. I know that you're originally from Sweden, correct?
Mm-hmm. True.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. Where'd you grow up? How did you grow up? Where in Sweden did you grow up?
So I grew up in a small town, probably about an hour's drive from Stockholm. I think it was roughly 90,000 people back in the day when I lived there, but it's much more now. I know 90,000 doesn't sound like a small town.
Yeah.
But it definitely was. Dad from Sweden, but his family was actually originally from Norway. So they came to Sweden during World War II.
Wow.
And then my mom, who's had a massive influence on my life, she was a refugee from Ethiopia.
Oh, wow. And so where did your parents meet? Did they meet in Sweden?
Yeah, so I'm told that they met at a party in Sweden at a mutual friend's house. That's all I know. I haven't really dug into that too much. I don't know how much I want to know.
Right. You're like, we met at a party. Okay. And so I guess at the point of your parents meeting, how long had your mom been in Sweden? Had she been there a while or was it fairly fresh?
I don't actually know. I think maybe 2 years, something like that.
Okay, cool. And so to me, I already think there's a story there because that means you were growing up kind of cross-culturally in Sweden, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so here's the thing that's fascinating. A few episodes ago, I had Lola Kimande Ackerstorm, who is a photographer, and she's in Sweden and married to a Swede. And we were talking a lot about like identity and how actually more diverse Sweden is than people think. So I'm curious, just even in your own childhood, did you even see diversity where you were, or was it still kind of on the up and up?
So, I mean, I think the story still is that Sweden or Scandinavia are nations of blondes, right? And we don't realize sometimes outside of Scandinavia, the reality on the ground. So there's been a lot of, migration, people that came in the 70s, in the early 80s, like my mom. So, I mean, I would say that in my town, there were a lot of immigrants actually from the Middle East, which is so ironic because now living here has, it's weird. In a way, it's kind of like I'm reconnecting with that side a little bit that I experienced growing up. So there was definitely diversity. I think that Sweden is not, or at least back in the day when I was growing up, it wasn't always the most inclusive, society. So it's quite segregated in some ways. I think that's changed a little bit because I've been away now for a while. So diversity in terms of having people from the Middle East, but I didn't see a lot of Africans growing up in our small town. So I think that made me, God, a lot more curious about Ethiopia, about Africa in general, because my mom she's very Pan-African. So obviously Ethiopia is her home. That's where she grew up. But she's very proud to be, African more broadly. So it just made me more curious about discovering, the continent itself, because the town where I grew up was so small, and I didn't really have, African or Black role models around me other than my mom. So it's kind of a natural evolution then moving to London, and I'm here as well. So it made me, coming from a minority background, even though a lot of people would look at me and say, you just look like another white guy.
Right, right. That's fair.
Yeah, I keep hearing that. But it made me curious to see more of the world, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm curious then, even with your small town and the proximity to Stockholm, was there more diversity? Like when you went into Stockholm, were you even seeing diversity there? And granted, everything's on a sliding scale given where you are, but did you see more diversity kind of in Stockholm at that time?
No, I definitely did. My godmother, who was Ethiopian, she lived in Stockholm. And I saw a lot of Black people, but I didn't really go into Stockholm that often growing up, maybe once or twice a year. Because my parents, they're small town people, even my mom. So she's very comfortable, too comfortable, I'd say, in some ways, both my parents. They just like to stay in their own small town. And it was a nice upbringing. I mean, I think my dad's family, for the most part, was very sort of embracing of my mother. There were a couple of hiccups. But so it wasn't a bad upbringing in that sense, but I think that looking back on it now, I definitely would have benefited more from being in not just a multicultural environment, but being in an environment where there were more successful Black people in general. I've always, it's something that I've craved for my whole life, actually.
Do you think that maybe part of that could be a reflection of, if you were in a community that had a lot of immigrants, and we all know it takes a generation or two for a family to get sort of settled in a country, irrespective of where they're coming from, especially if they're not necessarily bringing wealth with them. Do you think that maybe that was part of it, just in terms of who you were seeing around, typical Swedish or not?
Tough question. I mean, I think that... God, I'm lost for words.
I should have also prefaced this by saying that Amanda is also a counselor, so I can get on the therapy couch real quick. Yeah.
So do you just want to? So just repeat that question, because I want to make sure that I'm answering it the right way.
Sure.
Sorry.
So I guess in terms of you saying wanting to see more successful Black folks, right? And obviously there were few Black folks to begin with, but I'm also wondering, do you feel like some of that desire is just because the people of color who were around, maybe if they were immigrants, maybe first gen, they're still kind of starting their success story, so they're not necessarily where they could be yet because of opportunity. Does that kind of make sense?
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. Because I saw a lot of missed potential, basically. And I don't want to speak for my mom, but I think that despite having a Swedish surname, despite being married to a Swede, despite speaking pretty much perfect Swedish, in a sense, people like her, and some people still today, it's like they have to overcompensate to be accepted as being Swedish, as being European in certain other countries. So, and she was very, I'm so lucky to have grown up with my mom, because she's so proud of who she is, but she doesn't think that she's better than anybody else.
Yeah.
So seeing this person who was incredibly hardworking, refugee, cleaned factories to make a living, basically did the morning paper rounds for several years when she was unemployed.
Yeah.
It just made me, I don't know, it just made me more sympathetic to immigrants and the challenges that they go through. And I think I recognized quite early on that maybe society at that point wasn't really inclusive enough, that it wasn't willing to look beyond, your origins and just like purely study your qualifications when you're applying for jobs. So I definitely think that she could have found more success, but maybe it was a different generation.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I guess I'm kind of curious then, just even in your own childhood, and obviously we'll move on to when you get to university, but
Mm.
did you ever feel any kind of tension just from the general community because you were biracial, multiracial, because you had a parent that was not, you know, typically Swedish? Did you ever feel any of that tension growing up?
I didn't, because of how I look. So
Mm.
I can't really pass the Swedish. I mean, maybe people would probably think that I'm Mediterranean. Some people thought that I was Arab, although that didn't happen too often. But
Yeah.
most people are very sort of light and blue, brown eyes
Yeah.
in Sweden. So it's quite rare to come across people that look like me and being purely Swedish. I don't think that happens too often.
Mm.
I can't claim to have faced a lot of racism. I have to be honest. I think that
Mhm.
people maybe assume that I was adopted. That's something I got quite a bit. My sister as well. But looking the way that I do and essentially, passing, it just it allows you to overhear a lot of conversations that make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I always felt the need to stand up for for people like my mom, because
Hmm.
I look the way that I do, but I'm mixed race, but I'm also black, and I'm also Ethiopian, and I'm
Yeah.
also Swedish. So I have all these things inside of me, but I can't deny one side over the other, because I don't
Right.
think that makes you a healthy human being. So I
Yeah.
would always question, some things that I heard that made me very uncomfortable. The N word being used in a very sort of liberal
Yeah.
manner, but at the same time, I realized that Sweden doesn't have the same history as the
Hmm.
UK, as the US. They don't
Hmm.
understand, the historical context
Yeah.
of things like that. So yeah, it was. Huh.
You're like, let's
it,
walk
wa- it
through my
was
childhood. Yeah.
it was. I mean, it was educational in a sense that it made me want to connect with the rest of the world, and
Mm.
I wanted to see successful Black people, successful African, purely from a therapeutic
Yeah.
point of view. And
Yeah.
I didn't actually realize that until maybe about 10 years ago, because I studied in the UK. Initially I did 1 year in the US, and then I wrapped up my studies in the UK, worked in the UK for a little bit,
Yeah.
and then I went back to Sweden for 2 years, and I was working for one of the biggest media houses in Sweden at that time.
Yeah.
And I was there for 2 years, but something didn't quite feel right, and I couldn't articulate it. And even though Stockholm is a multicultural
Hmm.
place, what I realized from having been away was that my cultural references of what's normal to me had changed, had
Yeah.
evolved. So then I decided to go back to London, and there's no place in the world that's perfect, right? But being back in London, that's when I really realized that actually I need to be in an environment where I see successful Black people.
Wow. Wow.
Mm.
And so, I mean, here's the things that come to my mind, and I'm going to jump on
Sure.
that US thing in a moment because
Mm-hmm.
that seems really
Mm.
interesting to me. So, teen years, young adult,
Mm-hmm.
let's, before you get to university, had you traveled within Europe?
I had traveled within Europe. Full disclosure, my family, we didn't have much money growing up, so we
Yeah.
traveled Scandinavia.
Okay.
I went to Norway to see my dad's family, extended family. Went to Denmark a couple of times. Didn't really travel as a family because of my my parents' financial situation. Me and my sister, we went with my mom to Ethiopia when I was 5 years old, and my sister would have
Wow.
been 4 years old. So that was my mom's first time going back.
Yeah.
That was the only time it was safe for her to go back, given her background and how she left the country. So no, we didn't travel. I mean, I lived in a bubble in a lot of ways.
And so I'm assuming you finished secondary school and then you decided to go to university where? Like, was that in the US or in the UK?
So finished secondary school, high school, decided I knew that I wanted to go to the US. I think the US had always been in the back of my,
right.
in the back of my head. I think I was slightly obsessed with it in a very, I don't want to say unhealthy way, but
yes.
I definitely expanded my view.
Yeah.
But so I decided to do a short university course for 6 months, English.
Okay.
To study English at a university level, so lit, history, covering the States, covering the UK. So that was a very much I think a great introduction to actually making that move and going overseas.
And I had a total brain freeze just because we're talking in English, and I realized, wait a minute, English is probably not even your first language. But I'm like, because right, which would make sense because you grew up in Sweden. But
Exactly.
my brain. So where did you go in the U.S.?
Small town in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Called Elizabethtown. So about 30 minutes from Harrisburg, I believe.
So you've left Sweden and your small town in Sweden to go to a small town in the U.S.
Exactly.
And cue culture
I was
shock.
shocked. I was shocked. The highlight of my week was walking to the local Kmart. It was tough.
What kind of threw you off? I guarantee I know some of the expectations you probably had, but what kind of hit you when you were like, wait, I'm in the small town here?
I mean, first of all, I think my campus was amazing. I would say that I had hoped to probably make more American friends, but I got embedded with the international crew very quickly. I think what surprised me was how segregated it was in terms of the student body, and you got the black kids, the white kids, and then the international students. People didn't really mix as much as I expected them to. So that surprised me the most. But it's I think it's a natural thing in some ways.
And I mean, the U.S. is, it's so fascinating because part of you wants to know if it's a history thing, and part of you wants to know if it's just you gravitate towards people you know and you like, and it also sometimes tends to be across racial and ethnic lines.
Exactly.
And so it's you never really know. But I'm wondering though. Did you have the opportunity to kind of go into some of the bigger areas, like some of the bigger cities while you were here during that period? And did that give you some of the American experience you were probably looking for?
Yeah, for sure. So I have, I have a lot of family in the DC, Maryland area, and I was able to connect with I call her my aunt, but she's technically my mom's best friend. So they fled.
Of course. Of course, she's your aunt.
Yes, African aunt, right?
Yeah, of course.
So they fled Ethiopia together back in the day, and they were the closest of friends in their teenage years. Spent a couple of years together in Kenya, and then they sort of went their separate ways. So I spent a lot of time with my aunt, my uncle, who would be her husband.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful experience because it was the first time in my life that I had met people I didn't know, and they just embraced me with open arms, and I was part of the family from day one.
Yeah.
It makes me emotional even talking about it. And I think culturally, we don't have that in Sweden in the same sense. But because my mom had been so close to them, any child of hers is a child of theirs, and maybe that's what you get in African culture. I don't know, but it was such a beautiful thing, and still to this day, I think of them as my spare parents. So I probably need to make more of an effort to stay in touch.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to call them. Call your spare parents.
Mm. But they had also been, my uncle had been very successful. He's one of the top spinal surgeons, I think, even globally. So it was interesting to see this Kenyan man who grew up in a rural community on the border between Ethiopia and Kenya, and then obviously he spent some time in the UK as well. Ended up in the US, and he's done really well. So again, going back to the therapeutic thing that we talked about, it was so lovely for me to see that actually you can be successful, you can have an impact, and you can be well respected. So that really, I've never had this conversation with them. I probably need to have it at some stage, but I think it changed my life.
Well, and here's the thing. I think when you talked about having this desire for kind of the community and sort of seeing successful Black folks, that is such a good area to be in, kind of that DC, Maryland, Virginia area, just because if you can see Black success, you can see Black excellence, you can see African success. Because there's so many different African groups. And you and I didn't talk about this, but my parents immigrated in the 70s from West Africa. And so that's an area that I've always seen all these different African immigrant groups come through. And you're right. Like if you were looking for those role models, that's one of the areas I would say to go, or go to Houston, or go, they have all these communities that you would go to, right? So yeah, that's super wild though. And I'm glad you're kind of reflecting on this now, because this is really, I think, if they have had that kind of impact, you need to check in on them to see what's going on.
You need to let them know.
Let them know. But so I'm curious then. So if you were in the U.S. for about 6 to 8 months, less than a year, basically, to do this English program.
So I did the English program. That was actually in Sweden.
Oh, okay. And then you came.
So then I came to Pennsylvania. This would have been in probably August or September.
Okay.
Of I think 2003. I'm dating myself slightly here, but 2003. And then I think I left June 2004. So it was less than a year. I always say that it was a year, but it was way less than a year.
And then had you already made the decision that you were going to go to the UK?
No, so my plan was to transfer. I wanted to go to a college closer to my aunts and uncles' house in Maryland, because it was tough being in that small town in Pennsylvania, and I couldn't imagine myself spending another 3 years there. Yeah. So I applied. I think I was accepted in the end, but financially it just wasn't viable for me to do that, and. It's quite different in Europe. You don't necessarily, parents can't necessarily pay for their for their kids' education because of obviously taxation and things like that. So I decided to go to the UK, and it's funny. One of my lecturers at my university in Pennsylvania, she had lectured at the uni that I ended up going to in the UK. Okay. And she told me, she said, Jim, you're crazy. You should go to the UK because you have an EU passport. So you have access to free education, more or less. I think it was £1,100 back in the day, which is, it's not much at all. Yeah. I don't even know what that is in US dollars, but probably less than what less than what we pay. So it didn't even matter. Yeah. Exactly. So, an admin fee essentially, and then you cover your accommodation as well. So, I was just kind of looking at the reality of being in small town Pennsylvania, not necessarily getting what I wanted out of that experience. Yeah. And I never had a desire to go to the UK or to live in London. I'd never even been there, in all honesty. Right. But I decided to go for it because the school that she recommended had a really good media program, and I got accepted. Went back to Sweden for a couple of months, and then started my studies. And this would have been 2004, I think in August or September.
Okay, so here's the transition from a personal experience that I'm really curious about. What was it like that short time going back to Sweden and then going from Sweden to the UK?
So, Okay, so first of all, this was a while ago, right? I mean, it was almost 20 years ago. That's absolutely
yeah,
nuts.
you're totally dating yourself. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay. I think
So,
I'm older than you, but it's all good. It's all good.
Okay, so one thing that really shocked me when I was in the US was that I completely started speaking with an American accent.
Right.
And I wasn't speaking Swedish on a daily basis.
Right.
Maybe I had that weekly phone call to my mom or to family. So when I went back to Sweden, I actually had an accent, which is bizarre. How can I have an accent in my own language? But I think these days we're so connected, right? We're consuming content in a lot of different languages. So I had an accent in Swedish, which was really shocking. But obviously I got over that pretty quickly. I'm just trying to remember. So it would have been three months. I was just counting down to go to the UK to start my new life. It was nice. It's nice to be home, see the family.
Yeah.
Connect with old friends, but I really felt like this was an old chapter, and I was so keen to start my career, because the thing is, or even my studies at that point, because I've always known that I wanted to be in the media, and I didn't want to waste any time. I just wanted to start as soon as possible, and even that 1 year that I did in Pennsylvania, when I was studying broadcast journalism, I ended up doing classes with seniors in my first year, which I think was unheard of in some ways. And I did really well, despite English not being my native language.
Your first language, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just extremely driven. I think too driven in a lot of ways, that I didn't really allow myself to have fun back then. But anyway, so that's what happened. And then I went to the UK. A place called Luton, so it's Bedfordshire, about 40 minutes outside of London. And I was in for a shock because so obviously the experience in Pennsylvania wasn't perfect, but it was nice. It was a nice campus. It was a very peaceful town. And then I landed in this place called Luton in outside of London, which it's quite rough, actually.
Is it? Wow.
Yes. I mean, one thing that really shocked me, not having been in the UK, was just the level of poverty that exists. Being from Scandinavia, I'm completely spoiled, right? We don't have, I mean, some people refer to the suburbs as ghettos. Ghettos don't exist in Scandinavia. And I don't want to call this a ghetto, but I would definitely say that it's a deprived area that hasn't seen a lot of investment. So maybe that's changed. But anyway, so I remember landing at the local airport and then taking the train into the town center. And it took me, I think, 5-10 minutes. And then I walked from the rail station to my future accommodation. And I was the Scandinavian kid. And I was looking at basically this, residential building that was going to be my home, and they had these carpets that looked like something out of the 80s. Yeah, it was a different standard of living, and I don't want to knock it, but in Scandinavia we're really spoiled. Life is good. People pay high taxes, but man, do you get a lot of stuff back.
As we have heard. Yes.
But I'll be honest with you, I didn't really appreciate it growing up, because I wanted to get out. I wanted to have that international career. I wanted to have other experiences. So I was willing to compromise on those things. But now, the older I get, I really appreciate it. And I'm, in some ways, my parents would be delighted to hear this, but I feel like I'm almost becoming a socialist, which is something that I'd never say. Because it's not who I am.
Right.
Exactly.
You heard it here first.
Because those are the values that I believe in. I don't think that you should be judged based on your background and your social status, or your perceived social status, based on what your parents have done in life. So it was humbling, but I pulled myself up, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But it's just one of these moments, I'll never forget it. And then that was a reality check, and I just got on with it.
And so I'm actually curious both in the U.S. and the U.K.
Hmm.
Um, without meeting you, do people even assume that you're Swedish?
Never.
So there's never even a moment where what.
Never. But I. Mhm.
So what tends to happen? Is it just people are like, "Where are you from?" Or they ask some kind of question where they're trying to unpack it, but they don't want to be rude, or
I mean, I always get that question, but one of the things that I love about London is it's a melting pot.
yeah,
You fit in. You don't have to justify yourself, and you might be asked where you're from, but I feel like it's not in a judgy way.
mm.
Maybe I'm not expressing that the right way, but I have so much love for
No, I
London.
got you.
It's such a beautiful city, and I haven't spent that much time in New York, but I think New York is multicultural.
Yeah,
London is international,
yeah.
with obviously multicultural elements as well, but it's truly
Right.
international. What was your question again?
So because I was just really curious, is that if people even
Mm.
recognize that they're Swedish when they meet you, or even, and I guess even an extension of that is, are they surprised to find out if you mention it that you are Swedish? Is there ever just a sort of,
Yeah, I mean, I think they are. I think once or twice people have picked up on my accent. So maybe sometimes my Swedish accent comes through. I'm not sure. I think my accent is so messed up these days. It's
yeah,
it's mid Atlantic, so I think it has influences of the US and the UK, and then I've just sort
yeah,
of made up my own accent along the way. But sometimes people ask if I'm Scandinavian, but it happens very rarely. But then when you point it out, they'll find hints of it, and then they'll continue pointing it out to me. But actually, if you look at my features, I could, if my hair was brown and I had blue or green eyes, I could probably pass for Swedish quite easily.
that would
And
probably
I
be,
think that's why a lot of Africans or even Ethiopians would never make the connection, because I don't necessarily look the part, right? I'm
right.
right there,
You're-
sort of bang in the middle between my parents.
right. Yeah, no, and I like to ask that question of everyone, irrespective of their
Mm.
background, especially when they either go back to quote unquote whatever the ancestral home is, and the people can kind of pick
Mm.
up there from there, or if
Mm.
they move to a different locale from where they grew up and see how do people sort of place you. Because I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like that is such, and it's interesting what you said about London. I feel like it's
Mm.
such a marker of the US where we're always trying to
Mm.
place people. I'm sure you have
Yeah.
noticed that, right? Where we're always like,
Mm.
well, where are you from? Where are your people
Mhm.
from? You know,
Mhm.
what,
Mm.
and it's fascinating when you meet folks who are coming from other places where that's not necessarily the question, because they are used to
For
sort of the
sure.
international environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually really tough coming to the US, I think, as an international person sometimes, because you have to find a way to navigate the racial
Yeah.
dynamics,
Yeah.
and it's if you I mean, obviously people around the world, they see BLM protest,
Hmm.
they understand what's happening on the ground, they're reading the news, they're consuming the news, but you don't really understand
Hmm.
what it's like to be black in America unless you've lived it. Or
Yeah.
maybe if I think if you're white in the U.S., obviously you've interacted with black people your whole life, and to some extent, unless you're living in a very rural place. But I found that very difficult. I didn't know what I could say or what
Mm.
conversations I could have with with Black Americans and African Americans. And I'm curious, right? I think that in my late teens, one thing that I didn't understand, I think this was probably the first time I went to Baltimore. I was staying with another aunt who had a coffee shop, I think at the courthouse in Baltimore, and one of the workers in her coffee shop was African American, and I didn't understand why she had an Anglo-Saxon surname, so I made the mistake of asking that. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? And
No,
it's
no, I know
and
where you're
it
going.
was it was a Scandinavian name.
Right,
So it's
right,
so it's
right.
this is yeah, it's just really difficult to, if you haven't been exposed, it's difficult to navigate those dynamics, and that's also why you know, I kind of told you earlier on that I understand why older people in Scandinavia would think that it's acceptable to use the N-word, for example. It's all about context, I think, and understanding, which through traveling and through having experiences and just meeting people from other backgrounds, that's how you learn. So I mean, I found that a little bit difficult to navigate initially. I'll be very honest with you, but I'm so fascinated with the U.S. African American culture, and I mean, I think it's just incredible what Black people have been through in America and then come out on the other side. I mean, it's still ongoing, right? There's still challenges, as we've seen this week, but hopefully, maybe things are moving in the right direction now. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so funny because we grew up different, but I came back to the U.S. So I was in the U.S. till I was 10. People have heard the story. Moved to Cameroon until I was 17. Came back by myself. And and obviously we present different. I'm dark skinned. You're fair skinned, and
you're clearly Black.
I'm clearly right.
Let's just call it.
For those who can't see, right. But what's really interesting is that what you're saying does resonate with me, because even with that, you still have to navigate. Like there's a crazy line that you're navigating whenever you start to get into race in this country, right? Because for me, what I always like to tell folks is, I left the country, I was a minority, fine, you know, you're a minority, whatever. I stepped into a place where I looked like the majority, but I've always sounded like this. So I've always sounded American, class differential, all of that, and then come back out of being in the majority, looking back into a minority, where then now you have to navigate the nuances. And as you know, this country is so big as far as the U.S. is concerned. The nuances even look different depending on where you are in the country.
Oh my God.
Right?
My God. Yes.
And so you're right. It is. I don't think people particularly understand the mental gymnastics a lot of Black and brown folks kind of go through, both who are born in the U.S. and raised, but those who come and to a certain degree, and this is the thing I think has always frustrated me, is that you can be a Black person from somewhere else, but once you come to the United States, like you're Black,
you have to deal with the reality of being Black in America. Right? Absolutely.
Like you don't get to be, Panamanian or German or Nigerian or French, because we've got it reduced to color, and so then we lose the nuance of stories and identity and history. And then all of a sudden, you find yourself in a situation where you have to react to things that maybe you never even thought or conceived.
And I experienced that firsthand, because my uncle, he was living and working in Alabama for a couple of years, rural Alabama, and just walking through the town, driving through the town with a Black family. I mean, obviously, I'm probably the only person who could pass for, maybe Latino or Mediterranean family. Right. And just, there's something in the air. You can't articulate what it is. But yeah, I've just never experienced anything like it in my whole life. And it's tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough.
And here's the funny thing about a place like Alabama. I tell folks, because I live in the South, Alabama is something like 30% Black. Like, it has one of the largest Black populations in the, if you look at Alabama and compare it to like a Minnesota, seriously, like the deep South, because slavery, that's where folks first came, and then they went to other parts of the country. And so, but you're right, it is all of a sudden, irrespective of where you come from, imagine you walk into your own racial narrative that you weren't looking for, but by virtue of just how the way you look. Yeah, man.
And especially being in that town with a Black family, that's when you really, I mean, had I been on my own, maybe my experience would have been a little bit different.
That's
but
fair.
even my cousin, who's half Ethiopian, I think half Greek, he was adopted.
Yeah.
But he looks more he gets mistaken for being Latino or Mexican.
Right.
And apparently someone at the supermarket walked up to him and asked him, there's no polite way of saying this, but are you an illegal alien? Purely based on what he looked like. And then he responded, even though he hadn't been born in the US, he was, naturalized. He responded in a perfect American accent. So there's something about Alabama. I mean, I that place in Alabama. There's some.
Sorry, I'm
there's
still
something,
stuck on the story that someone walked up to someone and had the balls to ask them if they were legal. And what were you gonna do if they said? First of all, if they said yes, but even okay. Anyway, sorry, you can continue.
I know. No. So what I was gonna say, there's just something in the air. Maybe it dates back to slavery. I can't articulate it. I don't understand it. I find it interesting, but it's like parts of the country are still stuck in that era and unable to move forward. And I think that's the story of America in some ways. You have this progressive, modern part that's looking ahead. Yeah. And then you have the rest of the country, like be it the South or maybe even the Midwest. Like, I'm generalizing very broadly.
Right. Yeah,
but that's what's so fascinating about the U.S.
And the thing is, it's in pockets too, right? So, I have a friend of mine lives in California for a long time, and California's got parts of it that rival the Deep South, right? But you are right. I think that's the tension that we're seeing, right? And especially I think with the past year in politics and the election and George Floyd, as much of the world, I don't know, watched either in horror or confusion, just sort of watched the past year. And so I'm then fascinated because you've alluded to this in terms of your professional career. How do you think these experiences you've had sort of, living in the UK, living in the US, you live in Dubai, you travel, how do you think it's impacted your storytelling and the kind of stories that you are sharing?
I mean, when I worked for CNN, I was definitely very interested in telling stories from Africa. I mean, obviously, yes, there was a therapeutic element to it, but I was genuinely interested in just highlighting news and interesting things happening that actually are relevant globally. So I think I sought those stories out a little bit. And then obviously I moved here, familiarized myself a lot with the Middle East as well. I find the global South, the developing world, really important. And I thought that I was progressive. I thought I was international living in London. And I'm not saying that I wasn't, but what I've realized now after moving here, having been here for a while, is I was very sort of London-centric in how I viewed the world. So London was the center of the world to me, in some ways. And I think what I realized just living here and being more exposed to people that don't necessarily have second passports, who have just arrived from Nigeria or India or whatever it is, it just it brings you closer to the developing world and people who have other experiences who aren't necessarily West African diaspora in the UK. Somebody that, I'm not going to say claiming to be Nigerian. Obviously, you can be Nigerian through having Nigerian parents, but if you're born and raised in the UK, you've also had a British experience or a London experience. So I think that it's just kind of changed my mindset when it comes to that a little bit. But in some ways, I mean, I do love London. I guess we'll see if I move back at some point full time. But it's definitely, it's exposed me more to other perspectives, and I'm so glad that I got that opportunity, because nobody's superior to you. We all have different experiences. We hold different passports, but that doesn't. How do I articulate this the right way? It doesn't capture your experience. And maybe that's what I realized through having a mom that was a refugee. So now people, obviously when they ask you where you're from, they want to place you in that box.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
I don't have a box that fits me. And I think certainly when I was younger, maybe that was a problem. Maybe I wanted to fit into the African box or the mixed race box or, even the Swedish box at times. But because of how I look, people don't want to accept me into a specific box, which has been challenging, but it's actually a blessing. It's a blessing because I'm not going to allow myself to be defined by how other people see me and expect me to be. And now I've formed my own identity, which is this hybrid of different places that I've been to, and then the experiences that I've had, having had the mom that I do have, but also having the Swedish culture. So I've accepted that, and I think that's been a journey, and people really struggle to understand that.
Understand that because you don't want to be in the box, and you don't need to be in the box. To be quite honest,
I think it's a blessing not to be in a box because you're not allowing yourself to be defined. You're more open to having other experiences. You're more open to learning from other people. I mean, I have friends from all over the world.
Yeah.
I have, obviously living in the UK, I had a lot of friends who were African diaspora or, recently moved from Africa, but also India and other countries in Europe, everywhere. So it exposes you to just a different mindset than you're used to. And I think in some ways, I know you're a counselor, but I became addicted to that because because it makes you're learning more about the world through other people. And I think that we're all defined by this. In some ways, this is one of the biggest challenges I have with the planet that we live on, that we're so defined by our own experiences. So then we're viewing the rest of the world through that prism.
Yeah.
I was doing the same thing, and now I try to look beyond that. It's not easy because I think we all have, we're all fighting our own prejudice in some ways. But I think it's just opened me up in a way that I didn't expect.
So here's where I then am a little bit fascinated in terms of kind of what you do in your career. What do you think is the challenge? And this might be a difficult question, but obviously you have an interest in the world, but you do have an interest in the global South and Africa and kind of more, I don't want to say the developing, what do we call emerging, whatever the positive terms are.
Global. I think global South is quite.
Global South that's the good one to use.
Although some people won't agree, but you can't please everyone.
What do you think is the challenge in telling the stories kind of coming from that region? Meaning, I know that that's kind of a low question. One of my frustrations as someone who obviously, like you, has ties to the continent is that sometimes the narratives that we see, it's never, let me not say it's never, that's the inappropriate word, but they're often framed within a negative context, right? And what do you think is sort of driving, I guess, when we're looking at storytelling that's focused on the region, but it's not necessarily the most positive stuff coming out, right? The war, the conflict always leads, but what about other stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent it's just the nature of the news industry. There's not always enough room for positive stories, but I would definitely say lack of diversity in newsrooms, in decision-making roles at an executive level.
Yeah.
And not only being interested in quote-unquote sexy stories that are regarded sexy for a global audience. I'm talking blockbuster, I'm talking... kidnapped schoolgirls. I hate to use the language in that sense, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or, terror attacks and so on. So it's believing that a global audience won't be interested in African stories that don't necessarily make the cover of the newspaper. And I think, if you're working for a global news organization, you have to reflect the world. And if you're not reflecting the world in your newsroom, not just in your newsroom at a ground level, but in decision-making roles, then your coverage is always going to be biased. It's always going to be biased because you're someone looking in from the outside. And that's not to say that you can't be, white British covering Africa or an African covering Asia. Yeah. But you need a lot more balance, I think. And one thing that I find really shocking when it comes to how Africa is seen by the rest of the world is just the utter ignorance in terms of all the development that's happening. Right. And I mean, Africa, obviously these are extraordinary times because of COVID, but certainly if you look at 2019, Africa was home to several of the world's fastest growing economies, essentially. But if I talk to people back home in Sweden or in London who aren't in that African bubble or the developing world bubble to some extent, they have no idea. They have no idea. So they don't understand what's happening. And I think that maybe, us in the media, we're doing a disservice to that audience if we can't tell those stories. So it's something that I'm very passionate about. And in all honesty, I wish I had been more outspoken when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I think that maybe I should have made more of an effort to sort of speak my mind and share my thoughts earlier in my career, but I felt like it was very difficult for me to do that without facing some backlash. But I think maybe when they hear it coming from somebody like myself, instead of someone who's clearly Black or African, maybe they'll. I don't want to say that they'll take it more seriously, but I'm in that group, but I'm also an ally who looks different. Right. So I have to be honest with you. In the UK, I found it very difficult to have those conversations, and I wish I had said more. I wish I had done more.
So I had Chipanda Chimbalu, who's over at Virtuala, and we had a similar conversation, and you guys are almost speaking verbatim, and I don't know if it's both the European both media. And I think it's the European, it's the media, it's you guys are kind of swimming in the same space, and that he talked a lot about that diversity, and we were talking right after George Floyd, right? So really the diversity in the media rooms. And so I'm going to presume then that if we're looking at like international media world stage, that probably the diversity at that top level is not where it could be at all. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's easy to. All right.
And a lot of it is window dressing. You can have talent that's Black or talent that's that ticks other non-white boxes. Yeah. And that's not to say that the talent doesn't have influence, but if everyone, and I believe in this, I feel so strongly about this. If you do not have diversity at an executive level, and you're not serving, you're a non-country specific broadcaster. Yeah. You're actually servicing the global world. You're doing you're doing your audience a massive disservice, I think, because it will be reflected in your coverage. But it's about seeing the value in that, and I think. Obviously, over the past year, things have changed. I think that a lot of companies are making more of an effort, but it just feels like window dressing or changing the color of your company logo on LinkedIn. I don't have the perfect.
Sorry, you said that. I just called someone else on that because I don't know what was going on. And then I was on LinkedIn and I went, did they change their logo? And I can't remember if it was for Black History Month, or if it was for Asian American awareness, or it was LGBTQ. Like it was something, and I went, okay, but are you really as progressive as that logo says you are?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And how are you creating opportunities for people within your organization? So maybe you don't have that representation at a board level or executive level or even senior manager level, but what are you doing to address it?
Yeah.
That's I see I'm not seeing enough action in that area.
And
So
go ahead. Well, I was going to say, and to your point, I think then what happens is that those of us, we've been fortunate in this life to be able to travel. A lot of people don't travel for a variety of reasons, and they may not get to see the parts of the world that we have seen. So what they know about the world often is going to come from what they see. Let's the two sources. It's going to be the news and it's going to be movies, right? Or music. And then I that's the thing that always concerns me, because then I can travel to places, and a lot of the stereotypes I run up against is because people have seen a stereotype about, it depends on what's going on that day, the US or West Africa, right? Right? Like depending on what's happening. And but I keep thinking to myself, there's so many vibrant stories, or even a different way in how you tell the story, right? Because I do think that you could tell some of the same stories, but if there are more perspectives in the room, kind of the angle you might take might look a little bit different than, for someone who's just kind of, I don't want to say removed, but doesn't have as much of a, I don't know, dog in that race or whatever, or stake in it. I don't know if that makes sense from a news standpoint, but does that kind of make, do you kind of get where I'm going with that?
No, I agree with you. What's interesting is I think it's changing a little bit, and Netflix is actually a good example of that, because Netflix, because they've expanded so much globally, right?
Yes.
So a lot of the shows that they're commissioning, even if it's a UK show or a South African original, because of the formula and the different variables that they're looking at, they want their shows to be able to appeal to a global, diverse audience, which I think is great. Sometimes it's interesting when you look at the casting, because you're seeing so many mixed race couples.
Yes.
And I wonder, like, are they doing this because it's a formula, or is it actually instrumental to the story?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I find that really interesting, and I wonder sometimes how that's going to affect the next generation. So if you're in your teens growing up, binging on Netflix, and you're seeing that kind of representation on I mean, hopefully, I hope kids are reading as well and not just relying on Netflix. Right. But if you're consuming that content on a daily basis, does it actually shift the mindset? I don't know.
I think it does. So what we're seeing with Gen Z, who way younger than
that's it. That's exactly.
But we are seeing it. So like, I'll give you a good example. Like, so I finally just was like, whatever, let me get on TikTok. But TikTok is...
I have an account. I haven't posted anything. I don't know.
But I'm not posting. I'm just, it is, you can spend like 2 hours just like watching 15-second increments of crazy, right? But one of the things that's fascinating kind of watching Gen Z on TikTok in particular, and to a certain degree, millennials and even younger Gen Xers, is that, to your point, I think we are seeing that representation where people are more comfortable, right? Yeah. With groups and with people and ideas that maybe they didn't grow up with. And so I think it's just the norm for them. And the other thing about Gen Z is that they're very value oriented. And I always have to tell employers this. So part of the reason you're seeing those mission statements, it's window dressing, but it's also, as they're interviewing, they are asking employers in a way that millennials and Xers did not. They're going, so tell me about how, you define diversity and inclusion. So I think we are getting there, but...
This is so fascinating. I was just thinking about this the other week. Actually.
Were you really?
Yeah.
Tell me.
And so obviously I'm working for myself now, but if I was interviewing for a full-time role, or if I was offered one, I would ask the company that question: what does inclusion and diversity look like at your organization?
Absolutely.
And then, unless I'm completely out of money in my my personal bank account and not desperate to go into that role, that answer is going to dictate whether I want to work for the company or not.
Absolutely.
I never thought I'd be in that position.
Isn't it wild?
It's wild, but I think because of the last year and then standing up for your values, I think sometimes when we work for these big you know, not just media organizations,
Yeah.
but conglomerates, I don't want to say that we're selling out, but you kind of have to, it's a difficult world to navigate. And
Yeah.
how do you bring, this is such a cliche thing, but how do
Yeah.
you bring your authentic self to work?
Yeah.
And is there even an opportunity to bring your authentic self to work and still be successful?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm kind of learning how to do that through running my own business.
Yeah.
But I've never felt like I could fully be my authentic self in a corporate environment. And on reflection, maybe that's why I wasn't as successful as I would have liked to have been, because I wasn't really,
being yourself.
you know, sharing my full color. So it's really interesting. Maybe it will be different for the next generation. I mean, I'm probably overthinking everything that I do. If I'm posting something on social media, I'm asking myself, okay, how is this going to be perceived by other people?
Same. But I think, so other disclosure, career counselor, I'm also a career counselor, so this is also why I talk about jobs all the time.
I'm going to have to schedule in a session with you afterwards and actually pay for your time.
You're like learning every part of me through my questions. But you are so right. And I think what's great about Gen Z is that they've kind of given everyone that license to ask the questions, because even the students and the clients that I coach, man, let me tell you something. Let me be really honest. So George Floyd happened, and all of a sudden, and I work with, so I also work at a university, and I work with a really particular group of students in a particular area, which is really a little bit more traditional. But after George Floyd, all of a sudden, my graduating class that was coming up this year, students were like, okay, we need to ask about diversity and inclusion now, because I really don't want to work for someone who cannot tell me how they, if they value this, how they implement it. And what we're seeing, and what I'm seeing with clients more and more, is that they just want to ask, because they're like, you know what? I don't want to work a job where I come to find out you're supporting something that I don't agree with or that I find very detrimental to society. And I think part of it is a function of age, but in terms of there be more caution with millennials and Gen Xers. I mean, definitely with boomers. Boomers are trying to, they're just kind of shocked. So, not all of them, but some of them are definitely like, what is happening? You just show up at the job, do your thing, and go home. But I think we are prioritizing values. We are prioritizing well-being. Mental health is another thing, kind of who we are. Like, we don't want to work all the time, which is why I think we're all doing what we're doing now. Which generations before. And okay, so this is crazy. And I know you're on LinkedIn. There is a story going viral right now, which is amazing. So this guy basically had a heart attack at work.
Okay.
And he's alive. He wrote a post from the hospital, right? But he basically said, I just realized, look, my first thought was, he had these chest pains, and his first thought was like, crap, I need to get this email to my boss. Oh my gosh, I have this project to do. Then he thought, wait a minute, what if something's happening? I hope my wife doesn't find me dead. And he basically decided, from now on, I'm cutting my hours. I need to lose this amount of weight. This job is great, but you know what? It's not worth my happiness and my well-being. Well, I mean, he also uses some colorful language, which I'm not going to use on the podcast. But
was he American? Is he American?
No, he was. You would have thought.
Because work-life balance. I mean, work-life balance is tough in the U.S. People don't even take their holidays.
No, we don't. No, he was British. He was British.
Okay.
But I swear to you, go on LinkedIn today. It's like the number, like 1, 2, 3. It's like one of the top 3 things trending.
Check it out.
And I'm just sitting there, and I'm thinking, and he's literally got the mask on, and he's like, you know how I know he wasn't American? Because a whole fight broke out in the comments over universal health care. So that's how I knew
why are we still debating these things? I'm so sick of it.
This is how I knew. No, because someone said, imagine if he was American, and then a fight broke out. So he was not American. But But my point being is that this guy literally was just sitting there going, I almost died, and I can't believe my last thought would have been, I need to send this email. Because I think he works for HBSC. And he's like, I have to send this email for this, that, and whatever. He's like, no, sorry, I'm done. And so, yeah, mental well-being and just quality of life. If we don't come out of COVID better on that front, then I think we had a massive missed opportunity in terms of reshaping work, reshaping culture, reshaping fit. I mean, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I think employers are definitely going to have to be a lot more flexible, and you're not necessarily going to go into the office every day anymore. So I think that's. I'd be surprised if that doesn't happen. I think it's going to be a hybrid model.
Probably.
For me, moving to the UAE definitely taught me about work-life balance, and it was the first time that I could just kind of take a step back, and I didn't have to worry about money. Again, living in London is really tough, especially when you're working in media and journalism specifically, if it's not a senior role. I think if you're a freelancer or if you're on the management side, it's easier, but I was living paycheck to paycheck. And commuting into work probably took about an hour each way. So it's tough. I don't want to complain too much, but then I came here and I found that I had a lot more time on my hands, and I was able to work out and just prioritize health, look at what I'm eating. I have put on a little bit of weight now, but
COVID. The COVID
as we all have. But now I really value that a lot more than before. And it's funny. I think in the UK, drinking is part of the culture.
Yeah.
And I've never been an excessive drinker, but I mean, certainly if I had a bad day, I would just go to the pub, maybe have a drink or two, have a little bit of sometimes a bitching session with colleagues or whatever. And now, yes, I do still do that sometimes, but I just ask myself, okay, how do I stay as healthy as possible?
Yeah.
How do I stay positive? Does it mean waking up early in the morning, working out, being in the sun? We're so blessed to have those things here.
Yeah.
So maybe I don't know. Maybe it's part of it is probably just getting older and shifting your mindset a little bit. But I think a big part of that as well is working for yourself instead of working for somebody else, and then realizing that you have to be disciplined because you don't necessarily have that same structure every day, and nobody's going to save you. You have to save yourself. Yeah. And that, I think, has been one of the biggest blessings, realizing that and taking that on board. And even if I find myself working full time, for somebody else in the future, unlikely, but you never know. Right. But if I do, that's going to be tough when you're used to managing your own time and your own life and being your authentic self, just like you like you referred to before. So I think it's so fascinating because my parents, they believe that you live and you work for the same company for decades. Of course. Retire, you get your money, and that's it. And the state is going to treat you well. And I just don't. I guess.
It's so generational, trust me. It's generational.
It's generational, but I don't want to outsource my life to somebody else.
Well, you know what it is? It's a marker.
And I don't expect other people to make the right decisions and treat me the way that I'd like to be treated. So I'd much rather be making less money, perhaps, and not have as much stability, but be my own man or own woman. Right.
Well, here's the thing, though. I think it's also a marker of being Gen X, millennials, is that, and Zers really, is that there's a suspicion. There's a healthy, Gen Xers especially are very suspicious, and I think older millennials are just because where the generations have sort of seen things just fall apart, so September 11 or 9/11, recessions, global recessions, kind of all these other things that have impacted people both globally and nationally in their countries. So we're not very trusting of authority to take care of us because they're not doing the best job they are with the generations that kind of came before. And so I think it's right. And honestly too, who wants to work all the time? And I think that's what I loved about living in the Gulf is that that's probably the first time I had true work-life balance. And it is a very American term. But you know what I mean? Like, it was just like when it was a certain hour, people bounced. Like, maybe even before that hour. It was not, we're not working late. We're not working on the weekend. We're not working on a holiday. And I loved it. And I absolutely loved it. And it can be hard to replicate when you get out of that space, but it looks like but then you also are working for yourself. So hopefully you're working that in.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because I think that was one of the things that frustrated me about Sweden and Scandinavia growing up, and then spending maybe the early years of my career there, and even when I worked in London, I was in a Nordic role, so I dealt with Scandinavian offices. So I noticed people don't respond to emails after 4:30 or 5, and you shut down, you shut off completely.
Oh my God.
You don't pick things up until the morning. So I didn't like that. I thought that there was something wrong with, even though I was familiar with that mindset.
They were prepping you for the life you needed to have. You're like, why are you doing this?
Again, this goes back to the socialist thing that I was talking about before. So now I think I don't know. Maybe something changes when you hit your mid-30s. Now I think that's the right approach. And actually, if you do your job properly,
right.
And I hated hearing this back in the day because maybe I didn't do things properly. I don't know. But if you do your job properly and there's a handover and you communicate clearly, there's actually no reason to be on email in the evening, and you pick things up tomorrow. I mean, obviously, if you're in news and you work on a live show, it's a different story.
Absolutely.
But there's another way of doing things, and I think we can learn from that. Like, even in the UK, work-life balance is much more of a challenge versus Scandinavia. And I think in the US, you could learn from it as well, because
I mean, we need it.
You need it. But I guess the question is, how productive are you guys? That sounds a little bit confrontational, but the reason why I'm asking is because the UK, even though people work long hours, apparently it has one of the lowest productivity levels in the Western world.
Wow. Well, so here's the thing I will say about the US, and I was talking to Lola, who I told you lives in Stockholm. I think one of our things is innovation and independence, right? So we will work but you can see the fruits of it, right? We'll work insane hours, but then there are things that kind of benefit the world or whatever. I think, though, what 2020 has showed us, though, is that, and I've said this even to my supervisors and people I've worked with, whatever, is that, quite honestly, you give me 4 days a week, I can knock this out. In fact, not being in the office, because I'm an early riser, so, I got my day can be done by 9 a.m. if I just don't have to talk to like 9 or 10, right?
Oh,
so,
okay.
And
starting what time though?
Man, I'm crazy. I'll get up at 4 and knock stuff out. 4 or 5. I'm early. But here's the deal.
Those hours are like magic for me. I remember back in uni, I would wake up at 5 and then I'd be done by 9. And studying, writing an essay, writing an article. I really need to tap into that more.
And then here's the thing. Then the rest of the day, I can do interviews, right? I can meet with people or whatever, because I don't want to look at my computer and have to be typing at 1, 2, 3, basically after lunch. So what's really cool is that we're seeing a shift now where they're thinking, okay, we've got to change things up, because number one, people have been productive and they can come into the office. Mental wellness is super important. And number 3, why are we doing the same thing over and over again just because generations have done it? It doesn't necessarily make sense. And so I totally agree with you. I think that the U.S. as a country, we know we don't take any of our vacation. Like every year we leave millions of hours collectively on the table, which is wild. Like we're not taking our full vacation at all.
But it's that fear. It's the fear of being replaced, right?
Yes, absolutely. Because you're like, but it's like a never-ending cycle, right? Because you
it makes sense. I hear it,
right? You work hard because you want to show that you're valuable, but then you don't want to work so, you don't want to show that you're so good at what you do that you make yourself efficient, that you get yourself out of a job. Out of a job. It's a weird cycle. And so, yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And it's interesting when you take it across the world, because then you go to other places where, I can't lie, my Americanness kicks in and goes, this could be so much more efficient, Italy, if you just opened up. No, if you would just, open the hours that you say you'd be open, or show up on time.
Yeah.
I'm just let me not call out Italy, but yeah,
teaches you how to be patient, especially
sure.
living here. Oh my.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I
be careful with what I say.
I definitely. But I started to embrace it living in the Gulf, and it was kind of cool just to have that different experience, and also because the work hours are different because of religious observation for the Muslim faith. And so all of a sudden I felt like I really only had Monday through Thursday, because the folks out west, we couldn't reach them anyway, and then no one's going to respond on Friday, and really no one's really doing anything Thursday after 1, 2, 3. So but as we
I
start
remember that
go ahead.
working in Stockholm as well, especially on a Friday afternoon, nothing gets done.
Nothing gets done.
Meanwhile, and I leaned into that as well.
Meanwhile, I'm getting emails at 4:59 on Friday, and the type A person in me wants to respond, but then I have to say, dude, it's okay. Monday, we'll be fine.
That's a beautiful thing. If you don't have to respond, if you can get away with it.
Well, 99% of the time you can. Let's just be honest. Most of the time it's us that are kind of putting that pressure. But as we start to wrap up, one of the things I like to ask people at the end, I like to do these. I call them lightning round questions. They're not really lightning round. They're just literally called lightning round because it's whatever comes to your mind first.
Okay.
And so we're going to do this. Did I actually write questions down this time? I did. Okay, cool. So first thing, you've been in media for a really, really, really long time. Well, let me not make it sound like you're super old. What has been your, and you can answer either or. What has been your favorite interview that you've done so far, or your favorite story that you've covered?
I would say, the most striking thing was covering the refugee crisis. So being in Italy, I think it was Sicily. I could be wrong. And there were these migrants that had just been. Obviously, they were stranded on dinghies out at sea, and then picked up and brought into land. Yeah. And they were all East African. East African, so they looked like my family members. And seeing those people coming on shore, it was very emotional. Yeah. Equally, I covered the migrant crisis in Greece as well. So I was on one of the islands that wasn't too far from Turkey, and seeing those migrant landings when the Syrian refugees themselves, there were some Afghanis as well. So they came over on the dinghies, and just seeing their facial reactions, seeing them making phone calls to family members back home, maybe other people who've already arrived in Europe, as soon as they get on shore, and the happiness in still being alive. I mean, obviously some people have lost family members and loved ones along the way, but I think that's always gonna stay with me.
Wow. Ooh, that's powerful. Didn't expect that, but I asked, so here you go. Second question. And this is real interesting in light of what you said earlier. What would you do? What would you do if you weren't in media?
So, I thought about life coaching, actually.
Did you really?
Yes.
Tell me more.
And no, I mean, I think that I've over the years, I've always had friends turn to me for advice and guidance around life decisions, career, and so on. So that's something that I had in the back of my head before. But actually, probably what I'll do now, and I want to try to see if I can sort of transition into it a little bit without leaving media behind completely. But I want to lecture in media part-time and just share some of my experiences, my knowledge. Yeah, to just, give opportunities and share insights with other people. So I think on Sunday, I have this catch up with a former colleague of mine from Kenya. He's studying in California at the moment. So it's interesting about, when it comes to getting older, and you've been in the industry for a while, people start reaching out for guidance and advice. And I think it's such a beautiful, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's a beautiful thing to give back, not just because I want to be a good person, but because I actually enjoy the process. And sharing those insights and experiences, but also learning from other people. So that's something that I really enjoy, and I think I need to do more of it because it makes me happy.
Yeah, no, you know what? And you're talking, I'm thinking that would be super cool because of just all the kind of folks that I come across doing the Black expat. And every now and then I've got like a couple young people who are thinking about media, and they've got this international love and this sort of, and I'm even thinking of one person right now. They have this, they're trying to figure out how to make it work. And so I think that your skill set would be very valued, especially when you're looking at sort of folks trying to get their way in. And folks who are trying to get their way in who maybe didn't have any exposure. They're kind of like the first ones in their family or whatever in their space to go in. I think, totally, especially in the digital age. So
and I find it so meaningful to be able to help people like that because, again, my parents, we did not have a lot of money. I wasn't that exposed through the experiences of my parents. And I never thought that I could have a career in the media industry, let alone on a world stage. I thought it was impossible. So I think that we're capable of doing so much more than we realize, but it's about using those resources that are available. And I think, again, just going back to growing up in Scandinavia, because of my mom's experience, I realized that, I should not take universal health care for granted. I should not take free higher education for granted because it becomes a launching pad for your career, whether you want to you want to be based locally or globally. So use what you got, what's available to you, and your voice and your experience matters. And then by bringing in those other perspectives, I'm so passionate about this. The content that you're producing, especially if we're talking about media, it's going to be so much more engaging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we need the human angle to be part of every single story that we tell. Once you get that, even if we're talking about politics, it's so much more powerful when you make that part of the story. Because I think that gets lost, unfortunately. And that's when people tune out, in my experience. Anyway, next question.
No, and just as an add-on to that, you're right. And in this past election cycle, one of the things that I think stood out to me as I was reading sort of American national media, when you kind of dug in, was I found myself gravitating towards the journalist who had a connection to that community or understood that community, whatever the community was, right? And so, especially when you got into like race relations and race issues, there is a nuance that the way that they could explain and articulate certain things that someone else wouldn't pick on. And you are absolutely right. It is worth it.
But do you know, can I just say quickly, what I find so interesting about that is having lived and worked in the UK and experiencing British journalism, I almost feel like we're taught to not bring those personal experiences to the table, to not get emotional. Maybe you care too much because you are Black or you are mixed race or you're part of that community. So it's almost like you're penalized for it. Whereas I think in American journalism, maybe there's more room. And I think opinion pieces, any type of content where you can share your personal experience and then, I mean, hopefully try to be a little bit critical as well, but put it into a bigger context. That's going to connect with people. So put some soul into what you're doing and don't be afraid to share your own journey. And
I think that's maybe what the shift we're seeing now in society, right? Where we are as we get more inclusionary, we start to see those changes.
I
really
like that
take
term.
root. Inclusion. Yeah. Well,
I'm
going
to start using it.
Inclusionary. Well, it's been, the alternative has been true for a long time, right? People have been excluded. So I'm like, we're now getting to a point where we're saying, don't be, I gave this lecture yesterday. Don't just be at the table, but now you actually have a voice that belongs and is allowed to be heard. And so that's inclusion. I think we're moving past just, we need different people, but you actually need to hear them, right?
Exactly.
And then, all right, last question. This is actually like the easier of the three. So last question. I just realized, because you gave not that I didn't expect you wouldn't give deep, thoughtful answers, but I was like,
sorry, have I been too thoughtful, too deep?
No, not too deep. Okay, last question. Yeah, so if you are currently in Dubai right now, if you are not in Dubai, where do you think would be the next spot you would love to live?
Ooh, so this is something that I'm thinking about right now. It's difficult because I'm pretty much open to living anywhere. However, having said that, my heart is in Africa. Whether that means living there full time or just being aligned in terms of time zones. So I'd probably say Europe, Africa, or the Middle East. But being able to travel as much as possible. I mean, I think Asia's interesting, but I don't really have a strong connection to that region. At the same time, I'm thinking about possibly heading back to the U.S. if the right opportunity arises. So I'm pretty much open. Let's see.
So basically, you said everywhere but Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, and South America, basically.
Pretty much. We'll see. Maybe even Sweden. Who knows?
No, and you know what? If you do go back to Sweden, I would be absolutely fascinated what it would be like for you living there after being gone for so long. Because that's always a story when you go back.
I'm doing a documentary on it, actually, based on my own. So not necessarily moving back, but what it's like to. So it's essentially exploring what the Black European experience is like through the prism of someone like myself who doesn't look the part, but then meeting people like my mother, essentially, who have either found success or challenges. So that's something that I'm really interested in doing, because I feel like we have to give these voices a platform, but I also want to share my experience in a vulnerable way. I can't claim to have experienced racism on a daily basis, because I don't think that's true. But I really want to share my experience, and then maybe bring some other people along the way who are going to be more receptive to maybe looking at the Black experience in Europe, because it's me. I don't know.
Okay, so when that happens, call me. A, because I want to see it. B, I want to promote it. See, I just love those kind of stories. That's the kind of video stuff we love to do anyway. And so I really, really want to follow that, because as you have said, and have definitely, we've talked about, Black experiences are nuanced, and as inclusionary as we are at the Black Expat, I'm always wanting to talk about experiences in other places, just so that people have a glimpse into that. And so I think that that's going to be a great story that you're going to tell. So I'm excited for you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And it's I never expected to be on a podcast like this because of who I am and my experience. And people, people don't see me in that manner. So
they don't see you in the manner.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to be able to share my story, because I think it's different from
the typical.
From the typical. I'm probably over analyzing what I'm saying right now, but I really appreciate the platform, and it's been an honor. So
oh my gosh,
thank you.
Well, Jim, I'm going to throw up when we, obviously, as everybody knows, when we go live on the website, we will have all your contacts. So folks who want to follow you on Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else and the stuff that you're doing. But thank you so much for coming onto the chatter. I promised it was going to be a lot of talking about you and just life. And I think we did that. As always, for everyone who's listening in, you can find us on theglobalchatter.com as well as theblackexpat.com. Thank you again, and we'll catch you next time. The Global Chatter with the Black Expat is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is produced by Justin Williams. You can find the show wherever you get your podcast or follow us on our YouTube channel at The Black Expat Presents.